Okay. So we have Liam O'Brien, who is perhaps best known internationally as the author of The Sparrowhawk, A Manual for Hawking, which came out in 1991, was it?
Yeah.
91. This book is now obviously, it's quite a collector's item because when it came out there had been very few books about flying sparrowhawks in particular. I think it's probably the most prominent one since Jack Mavrocordatto's Hawk for the Bush.
The Hawk for the Bush, yeah.
At that stage. Can you tell me about your decision to write about the sparrowhawk in particular? Give us an idea of the context of the time.
Well, that's interesting because number one, that's what I was flying at the time. In fact, those were the days in Ireland when really you could only fly two birds of prey, a kestrel or a sparrowhawk. There were no peregrine falcon licenses issued. So to a very great extent, there was a ban on flying falcons. Also, there were no goshawks in the wild in Ireland, and it was virtually impossible to import goshawks because of agricultural health regulations. So we were, if you like, we had all our eggs in one basket to a great extent. Anybody interested in falconry, they got it from books, but in a practical sense, if you went out into the field, you went out with a sparrowhawk. And we could, ironically, actually get licenses to take sparrowhawks from the nest. So, on the one hand, it was circumstances, but then as a result of all that, I found after 4 or 5 years, I'm always a very careful sort of hoardy kind of a person, and I used to make a lot of notes. And I after a while I realised that, the only thing to do is order all this. And so I started to fill the notes in, fill in the gaps, and compile a kind of a notebook, journal, diary, maybe perhaps for my own sake, just to see just exactly how much I was learning and to get it down so that I wouldn't forget it and I could refer to it later on. So in a way the book evolved out of the circumstances, and it was a kind of a practical tome to work from on a daily basis.
It was during a period when a lot of expertise had been built up by the sparrowhawking community here in Ireland out of this necessity. It was the only choice that they had. And someone once described it as the situation where the bird that is traditionally considered the most difficult to train was actually the bird that the Irish were best at flying.
Yeah, because we had nothing else. There was an interesting kind of, another interesting facet to all of that, because what I discovered was fairly quickly that, when you were flying a sparrowhawk, there was really no great fun in it on your own. It seemed to me to be a sort of a group exercise. It almost demanded that you had a group. And that may have very well have been from the fact that, hunting with the sparrow anyway, in the Irish countryside, you had to have beaters. And almost inevitably the beaters themselves would be, if not falconers, would be certainly very interested in hawking. So it just meant that when you went out, the likelihood was that there was 5 or 6 falconers together and we'd all beat for each other. And it became very obvious very quickly to all of us that there was great benefits in this. I mean, first of all, it was a bundle of fun. It was great because everybody met on a Saturday, on a Sunday, bank holidays, any spare time you had, and particularly even in the summer evenings. It was always like in July or August, it was always well within the gambit of getting home from work or wherever, going out for a couple of hours hawking as a group. So there was that kind of social aspect to it as well, but then we all, inevitably fed off each other. So you always had 5 or 6 hawks to compare yourself with. And as I say, that the fun was good, the banter was good. And then the other interesting thing, I was actually just thinking about it on the way down here, that we noticed also that there was a knock-on effect of this group thing with the sparrowhawks. Because as you say, sparrowhawks are very difficult to fly, very difficult to train, rather. And it was funny because we had a tendency in Ireland in those days when we took sparrowhawks from the nest, we didn't tend to take them too early. We didn't like imprints. You know, anybody who's had an imprint sparrowhawk will know what I'm talking about. I mean, they are just so nerve-wracking. It's unbelievable. And their behaviour, if they're not imprinted properly, now the modern methods for imprinting are far superior as to what they, you know, compared to what they were like, say, 30 years ago. So, you know, 30 years ago, if you went out with a fully imprinted sparrowhawk, you went out with a bundle of problems, not least of which was the tendency not to want to hunt. So what we did was, by way of experiment, we used to watch the nests and we'd take the birds as late as we possibly could. And the knock-on effect of that was that there was that degree of wildness in the birds which gave them that lovely aloofness, which I always loved. But the problem then was that you had manning. We had quite a lot of manning to do with a brancher, for example. So to come back to what I was saying, the knock-on effect of the group thing was very interesting because the fact that you were out with a crowd, it meant that by the time, say for example, you'd been in the field with a young hawk which you were training for maybe 4 or 5 days, it was bomb-proof because of the group thing, you know. And we used to encourage people to get up suddenly, do things, you know. I remember one guy even, he used to always insist on jumping over his hawk when it was on the bow perch. And we said, what are you up to? You mean, you know, stop that clowning. Oh, no. He said, this is good for the hawk. He said, it's, and watch. And he'd jump over the hawk and the hawk wouldn't move, wouldn't flinch. And then eventually, as we got more experienced and the group, I suppose, in a way bonded, we found ourselves going off on weekend trips. So the day out thing turned into a weekend with a camping aspect. So we drive off into interesting terrain where there was plenty of quarry. And we take tents and camp out for the weekend. So the lovely thing about that was that I suppose we were romantics in a way. We almost felt like we were Arab falconers in the middle of the desert, and there was nothing as nice or as romantic as waking up in the morning and there was your sparrowhawk at your feet, asleep, you know, or staring at you. And because of that close proximity, everybody slept with their bird. Again, the birds were as steady as a rock. So, you know, it was interesting the way one thread connected to the next and connected to the next. So in a way we were learning all the time, but we were adapting.
What do you think of the current falconry climate in Ireland compared to those days? Do you think it's maybe a little bit sad that we've lost that sparrowhawking tradition, or it's been diminished anyway to compare to those days? Or do you think it's a good thing that we now have access to all these different species and better telemetry systems and all these things? Can you comment on it? Yeah,
well, I think maybe what you say is right. That's the current situation has changed utterly. There's the advantages. There's a bit of both. Sadly, the sparrowhawks have been almost sort of reshelved onto the bottom shelf because of the availability now of captive bred falcons, goshawks, et al. So I remember being very conscious at the time when the first peregrine licenses were issued. There was a rush from the falconry community, including, you know, people who were with me, sparrowhawk enthusiasts. Everybody rushed for falcon licenses. And very quickly you could see that you know, oh, enough of those little things. We want a peregrine falcon. Bigger is better. And sadly, that resulted in just as you say, that the sparrowhawk was diminished. But also the knock-on effect of that was that it, for quite a considerable time in Ireland, it actually fragmented falconry. Because for the few people that there were, I mean, bearing in mind it's a small country, I mean, what, 4 million people? So you've got to take a population of falconers from that. So you can imagine that, you know, nationally we would have had maybe 50, 60 falconers, 30 of whom would have been very active at any one given time. And so, you know, break that down into the number of people who still wanted to fly sparrowhawks, and then the number of people who wanted to fly peregrines, you were left with very, very few interested in sparrowhawks. And at the same time that that happened, it began to become just a little bit easier for people to get import goshawks. And then very soon after that, harrishawks came on the scene. So what I saw, very sadly, was a fragmentation. So you had small, very small groups of people who were becoming specialised in what they wanted to do. And there really wasn't enough, if you like, to go around or to fill up the gap that had been created with the sparrowhawks. So that has actually, I think, maybe even become more of the case now. I would rather have liked to have thought that, you know, maybe perhaps after an initial kind of, oh, isn't that wonderful, that people would suddenly realise, oh well, you know, we did have it good after all. Sparrowhawks are fantastic, but I don't see that happening at the moment. I don't know why, but I don't see it happening.
You yourself then moved on to long wings. After your sparrow phase.
You know, I have to say that is the case.
Can you explain about that movement and how that came about?
I certainly can't make any excuses for it. I think I have to put myself in exactly the same boat as all the other guys who did the same thing. Bigger was better. And I remember I suppose there was also a kind of a social status thing about getting a peregrine licence. Somehow or other, if you could manage to get a peregrine licence, excuse me, it would give you a certain kind of status. There was an imprimatur there, a stamp of approval, which people wanted for eco reasons or whatever. So, like the rest, like everybody else, I was victim to that and went for a peregrine licence, and I got a tiercel. And because of the kind of landscape that I lived in, or still live in, it wasn't really waiting on falcon country, not by any stretch of the imagination. So I had to tailor my clothes according to my measure. And I remember, without any great effort, this little tiercel became very, very good at killing crows. Very good. And I flew him for 4 or 5 years doing that until I put him into a breeding program. So at the same time, I was flying the odd sparrowhawk, but the book had been published, written, so it was kind of like been there, done that. And I remember being at a falconry fair with the book, in fact. It was in Northampton. And a mutual friend introduced me to Nick Fox. And in the course of the conversation, Nick invited me up to Northumberland to see some crow hawking. So, in actual fact, within several weeks, I found myself in Northumberland. And I have to say, it was a watershed for me to see crow hawking at that level of expertise. So it also made me realise that possibly peregrines were not the best for crow hawking, because there was an understanding at the time that some of them could be good, but more than 50% of them were difficult. They seem to have that extra intelligence that there's a lot of effort here in chasing crows, and they didn't seem to do too well flying off the fist out of the hood by comparison to the hybrid, the Saker falcons, the peregrine Sakers, and the Gyres Sakers. They were unimaginably good at what they did, and that was particularly flying out of the hood from the fist. They seemed to have that tenacity, that sort of extra aggression, whatever. I don't know what it was, but there was something in them that just seemed in their nature to be that they suited flying out of the hood from the fist. I presume that's why the Ards are so successful with them, because that's maybe the way they hunt in their own environment. I don't know, but certainly that's what I saw in Northumberland. So when I came back, I kind of resolved then to try and take my own crow hawking a step further. So I got a hacked tiercel from Nick, and I hunted very successfully with him. He was an absolutely amazing crow hawk, and as I say, particularly good at flying out of the hood. So that really took me on another journey then, and I flew crow hawks for probably about another 10, 15 years after that.
Was the falconry scene, if you like, in Ireland during those times, perhaps even before, during the advent of the sparrowhawk, was it very inward looking? Was it getting influences from foreign countries? We know now, for example, there's huge traditions of flying sparrowhawks in Pakistan and Tunisia. Was there any awareness of these places and the methods they were using?
Yeah.
There was?
Yeah.
Okay.
We read avidly. Now, the snag was that you didn't have the internet. You couldn't open up your iPad and tap in, whatever, and look it up and see a YouTube instantly. We relied on library books. And in fact, I remember books were very difficult to come by, because there were two things. Economically, Ireland was a pretty poor country, and most of us didn't have the money to buy books. So in fact, what the Irish Hawking Club very cleverly did was they started to buy books, and they built up a library. So it meant that you could borrow a book for 3 or 4 months, and literally practically learn it off by heart, or maybe photocopy every second page. And that's what we did. We learned from those books, and anything readable at all on the subject, we read it.
Was there any book in particular that you turned to more often than others?
Well, excuse me. Well, from the point of view of the sparrowhawk in particular, the one that we used as a sort of a Bible was Maverick was a hawk for the bush. And that was really the only one that specialised in the sparrowhawk. So I realised, I suppose, having a certain entrepreneurial streak in me, that there was a gap. So that probably might have been one of the other reasons why I decided to actually write up the book in the end and publish it.
Can we go back to when you first started out in falconry? When did you realise that you wanted to train a bird of prey, that you were gripped by falconry?
Well, actually, that all happened by accident, because from a very early age, from a boy, I've always loved birds, and I always kept pigeons, and I actually had a breeding pair of fantail pigeons, which I'm particularly fond of. And I remember coming home one day and finding one of them missing, and a neighbour said that they had sighted a hawk in the garden. So I searched, and I eventually found the carcass of the bird, And I swore vengeance on that hawk, and I decided, you're gone. So I made a trap, improvised with bits of wire and all sorts of things, and I trapped the sparrowhawk. To my utter shock and surprise, the trap was successful. And when I saw this creature staring up at me with yellow eyes and cadmium yellow feet, I couldn't believe it. I thought, my God, you're magnificent. So I just lifted the trap and released it. And I thought,